Listen carefully, United Nations Human Rights Council. 5 minutes ago, I signed the death penalty into law for traitors, terrorists, and spies in Burkina Faso. You thought threatening sanctions would force me to keep our enemies alive. You believed your reports gave you power over African justice. You watched other leaders bow to your pressure and abandon capital punishment. You were wrong about me. I'm bringing back execution for those who betray our 54 nations. Traitors will face death, and your protests mean absolutely nothing to Burkina Faso. Let me tell you exactly what happened. On December 4th, 2025, my Council of Ministers in Burkina Faso adopted a bill restoring the death penalty for 3 specific crimes: treason against the state, terrorism, and espionage. On December 8th, I signed that bill into law. The death penalty had been abolished in Burkina Faso for decades under pressure from Western governments and international organizations who claimed capital punishment was barbaric and incompatible with human rights. I brought it back because Burkina Faso's survival requires it. The law is precise and limited. The death penalty applies to individuals who commit treason by attempting to overthrow the government, destabilize the state, or collaborate with foreign powers against Burkina Faso's sovereignty. It applies to terrorists who conduct attacks designed to spread fear, destroy infrastructure, or harm civilian populations. It applies to spies who gather intelligence for foreign governments or organizations seeking to undermine our national security. These are not ordinary crimes. These are acts that threaten the existence of Burkina Faso as an independent nation. Listen carefully to why this law became necessary. Since I took power on September 30th, 2022, Burkina Faso has faced constant attempts to destabilize our government. Multiple coup attempts have targeted me personally. Foreign intelligence services have infiltrated our institutions to gather information and sabotage our policies. Terrorist groups backed by external forces have conducted operations designed to create chaos and justify foreign intervention. Traitors within our government have collaborated with these enemies to undermine our revolution. The previous legal framework treated these existential threats as ordinary crimes punishable by prison sentences. That framework failed to deter enemies who saw temporary imprisonment as acceptable risk for attempting to destroy Burkina Faso. The most serious coup attempt occurred in September 2023, exactly 1 year after I took power. Military officers conspiring with foreign intelligence services planned to overthrow my government and restore the previous regime that had been subservient to French interests. We discovered the plot before execution and arrested the conspirators. Under the old legal system, these traitors faced maximum sentences of 20 years imprisonment. They would eventually be released, free to plot again or to flee abroad where they could continue working against Burkina Faso from exile. That outcome was unacceptable for crimes that could have plunged our country into civil war and reversed the revolutionary changes we implemented. Terrorism represents an even more immediate threat requiring the ultimate penalty. Jihadist groups operating in the Sahel have conducted operations across Burkina Faso that have displaced over 2 million people, destroyed hundreds of villages, and threatened our territorial integrity. These groups receive funding, weapons, and intelligence from external powers seeking to destabilize the region. Their attacks are not random violence. They are strategic operations designed to make Burkina Faso ungovernable, justify foreign military intervention, and prevent African countries from achieving genuine independence. The old legal system treated captured terrorists as criminals deserving of trials, appeals, and eventual imprisonment. That approach failed to deter terrorist operations because fighters knew that capture meant imprisonment rather than death. The death penalty changes that calculation fundamentally. Espionage has become increasingly sophisticated and dangerous as foreign powers intensify efforts to monitor and manipulate African governments. Western intelligence services operate throughout Burkina Faso, gathering information on our military capabilities, our partnerships with Russia and China, our resource nationalization programs, and our internal political dynamics. They recruit agents from within our government, our military, and our civil society. These spies provide intelligence that enables foreign governments to pressure us economically, isolate us diplomatically, and plan interventions against us. The previous legal framework treated espionage as minor crime punishable by short prison sentences. That failed to deter recruitment because potential spies calculated that the financial rewards from foreign intelligence services outweighed the risk of brief imprisonment. Death penalty for espionage eliminates that calculation entirely. The United Nations Human Rights Council issued a statement within hours of my signing the law, expressing deep concern and calling on Burkina Faso to reverse the decision. The statement claimed that death penalty violates international human rights standards, that it has been proven ineffective as deterrent, and that it risks being applied arbitrarily against political opponents. Human Rights Watch published a longer report making similar arguments and demanding that international community pressure Burkina Faso to abandon the law. Amnesty International called the restoration a dangerous regression that threatens human rights across Africa. Western governments issued individual statements condemning the decision and warning that it could affect Burkina Faso's international relationships. I rejected every argument they made because their opposition is based on hypocrisy rather than principle. The United Nations Human Rights Council includes countries that actively practice capital punishment, including the United States, which has conducted executions throughout its history and continues to maintain death penalty in multiple states. The Council includes countries that conduct targeted operations resulting in deaths without trial, including drone strikes that eliminate suspected terrorists without judicial process. The Council includes countries that have conducted military interventions resulting in massive civilian casualties while claiming to promote human rights. These countries have no moral authority to lecture Burkina Faso about capital punishment when they practice state-sanctioned death in forms far more expansive than our limited death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage. The claim that death penalty is ineffective as deterrent is contradicted by the behavior of criminals who go to great lengths to avoid jurisdictions that practice capital punishment. Terrorists operating in regions where capture means death take significantly greater precautions than those operating where capture means imprisonment. Spies recruited by intelligence services demand higher compensation and more protection when working in countries that execute spies. Coup plotters carefully calculate whether foreign support will protect them from ultimate consequences if their attempts fail. The deterrent effect may not be absolute, but it is real. More importantly, death penalty serves purposes beyond deterrence. It permanently eliminates threats that cannot be rehabilitated, and it delivers justice proportionate to crimes that threaten national survival. The warning that death penalty risks arbitrary application against political opponents is projection of Western fears rather than assessment of Burkina Faso's reality. The law I signed specifies precisely which crimes qualify for capital punishment: treason, terrorism, and espionage. These are not vague categories that could encompass peaceful political opposition. These are concrete acts with clear definitions and evidentiary requirements. Political opponents who criticize my government, organize alternative movements, or advocate for different policies face no legal jeopardy under this law. Only individuals who actively work to overthrow the state, conduct terrorist operations, or spy for foreign powers face capital punishment. The Western organizations claiming this law threatens political opponents are really concerned that it threatens their agents operating within Burkina Faso to destabilize our government. Listen carefully to the international context that makes Western opposition particularly hypocritical. Multiple African countries have maintained or restored death penalty in recent years as they confront similar threats of terrorism, foreign interference, and internal destabilization. Mali never abolished capital punishment and continues to maintain it for serious crimes including treason and terrorism. Niger maintained death penalty throughout its history despite Western pressure to abolish it. Chad restored capital punishment after a period of de facto moratorium because security threats required stronger deterrence. These countries made independent decisions based on their security needs rather than Western preferences, and they have faced similar international condemnation that they correctly ignored. The United States maintains death penalty in 27 states as of 2025 and conducts federal executions for crimes including treason and espionage. The U.S. government has never abolished capital punishment despite decades of international pressure and clear evidence that the practice is applied disproportionately based on race and economic status. Yet the United States lectures African countries about human rights and demands that we abandon capital punishment while maintaining it domestically. This double standard reveals that Western opposition to African death penalty is about control rather than human rights. Western powers want African governments to lack the legal tools necessary to defend sovereignty against foreign interference. China maintains death penalty and conducts more executions than any other country, including for crimes of corruption, drug trafficking, and economic crimes far less serious than treason or terrorism. Russia maintains death penalty in its legal code even though it has observed moratorium on executions since the 1990s. India maintains death penalty and conducts periodic executions for terrorism and other serious crimes. These major powers face minimal international pressure compared to the condemnation directed at African countries that maintain or restore capital punishment. The disparity proves that Western human rights advocacy is selective and political rather than principled. The most revealing aspect of Western opposition is the alternative they propose. When pressed on how Burkina Faso should handle traitors who attempt coups, terrorists who conduct operations, and spies who work for foreign governments, Western organizations offer no effective solutions. They suggest imprisonment, but cannot explain how temporary detention deters individuals willing to risk their lives for financial compensation or ideological commitment. They suggest rehabilitation, but cannot explain how to rehabilitate individuals whose core identity is opposition to Burkina Faso's independence. They suggest international monitoring, but cannot explain why we should allow foreign oversight of our justice system when those same foreign powers are supporting the enemies we are prosecuting. The practical effect of Western opposition to death penalty is to make African countries more vulnerable to the very threats that Western powers are sponsoring. Foreign intelligence services recruit spies more easily when potential agents know that capture means imprisonment rather than death. Coup plotters receive more support from external backers when they know that failure means temporary detention rather than ultimate penalty. Terrorist groups operate more aggressively when fighters know that capture means eventual imprisonment and possible exchange rather than execution. Western opposition to African death penalty serves Western interests by weakening African defenses against Western interference. I implemented the death penalty despite knowing it would generate international condemnation because Burkina Faso's sovereignty requires that I prioritize our security over Western approval. The decision reflects broader principle that guides my leadership. African countries must make decisions based on African interests regardless of Western opinions. For decades, African leaders accepted Western guidance on governance, economics, security, and justice because we were told that following Western models was necessary for development and international acceptance. That approach failed completely. African countries that followed Western prescriptions remained poor, dependent, and vulnerable to foreign interference. The path to genuine African independence requires rejecting Western models and implementing policies that serve African needs, even when they contradict Western preferences. The death penalty law is one component of broader security architecture I am building to protect Burkina Faso's revolution. Other components include the Volunteers for Defense of the Homeland program that armed 50,000 civilians to fight terrorism, the expulsion of French military forces that served French interests rather than ours, the partnership with Russia that provides military equipment and training without political conditions, the nationalization of gold mines that redirects revenues to Burkinabe development, and the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States that enables Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to coordinate security policies independent of Western-backed ECOWAS. Each of these decisions faced intense Western opposition and predictions of failure. Each decision proved necessary for Burkina Faso's survival and success. Listen carefully to what the death penalty represents strategically. It is not primarily about punishment or deterrence, though it serves both purposes. It is about demonstrating that Burkina Faso will defend itself using whatever legal tools are necessary regardless of international opinion. It sends clear message to foreign intelligence services that their agents face ultimate consequences if caught. It sends clear message to potential coup plotters that foreign backing will not protect them from justice. It sends clear message to terrorist organizations that Burkina Faso will respond to existential threats with maximum force authorized by law. Most importantly, it sends clear message to our population that our government has the will to defend the revolution they support against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The timing of the law's adoption and signing was strategic. December 2025 marked 3 years since I took power and 2 years since the most serious coup attempt against my government. The period demonstrated that external threats to Burkina Faso were intensifying rather than diminishing as our revolution achieved more success. Foreign powers increased intelligence operations as we nationalized resources. Coup attempts continued as we expelled French forces and partnered with Russia. Terrorist operations escalated as we demonstrated that African security forces could defeat insurgencies without Western military support. The death penalty became necessary because our enemies were escalating their efforts to destroy what we were building. The Council of Ministers' adoption of the bill on December 4th followed months of internal discussion about appropriate legal responses to security threats. I consulted with military commanders about operational needs, with intelligence services about foreign threats, with legal experts about constitutional requirements, and with traditional leaders about community expectations. The consensus was overwhelming that Burkina Faso needed stronger legal deterrence against treason, terrorism, and espionage. The death penalty was not imposed arbitrarily or emotionally. It was adopted through deliberative process after careful consideration of security requirements, legal frameworks, and international implications. My signing of the law on December 8th was public ceremony broadcast nationally to ensure every person in Burkina Faso understood that our government would defend the revolution with maximum legal force. I explained during the signing that the death penalty would be applied only to individuals who committed the 3 specified crimes of treason, terrorism, and espionage. I emphasized that political opposition, peaceful protest, and critical speech remained protected and would never be subject to capital punishment. I warned potential traitors, terrorists, and spies that they now faced ultimate consequences for actions against Burkina Faso. The message was clear and direct. Our revolution will be defended by any means necessary within our legal framework. The international reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. Western governments issued statements within hours expressing concern and disappointment. The United Nations Human Rights Council called emergency session to discuss the decision. Human rights organizations published reports condemning the restoration. Western media portrayed the law as evidence of authoritarian tendencies and democratic backsliding. None of this surprised me because I understood that Western opposition had nothing to do with human rights and everything to do with geopolitical control. Western powers oppose African death penalty because it makes African countries harder to destabilize through foreign interference. African reactions were mixed but increasingly supportive. Mali and Niger, our partners in the Alliance of Sahel States, publicly endorsed the decision and noted that they maintain similar legal frameworks. Chad indicated sympathy with Burkina Faso's security concerns even though it faced similar Western pressure. Several West African countries that officially criticized the decision privately indicated understanding of why we took the action. The public criticism reflected pressure from ECOWAS, which remains influenced by Western powers, while private support reflected genuine African understanding that sovereignty requires strong defenses against foreign interference. African civil society reactions revealed important dividing lines. Organizations funded by Western governments and foundations condemned the death penalty and echoed international human rights talking points. Organizations rooted in African communities and funded by African sources largely supported the decision as necessary response to real security threats. The divide illustrated broader pattern where African civil society funded by Western sources tends to advocate Western positions regardless of African interests, while African civil society independent of Western funding tends to advocate African sovereignty even when it conflicts with Western preferences. The death penalty debate clarified which African organizations serve African interests and which serve foreign agendas. Popular support within Burkina Faso was overwhelming. Surveys conducted after the law's adoption showed over 80% approval among Burkinabe citizens. The support reflected widespread understanding that our country faces existential threats requiring strong responses. Burkinabe people have experienced coup attempts that could have plunged us into chaos. They have experienced terrorism that has displaced millions and destroyed communities. They have witnessed foreign interference designed to reverse our revolution and restore foreign control. They understand that death penalty for traitors, terrorists, and spies protects our collective security and independence. The Western organizations claiming to speak for human rights ignore the reality that most Burkinabe people support capital punishment for enemies of our state. Listen carefully to the broader implications of this decision for African sovereignty. Every time an African country implements policy that Western powers oppose, we test whether African independence is real or rhetorical. If we reverse decisions because of Western pressure, we prove that our independence is limited and conditional on Western approval. If we maintain decisions despite Western opposition, we demonstrate that our sovereignty is genuine and cannot be overridden by foreign displeasure. The death penalty law is test case of Burkina Faso's independence. I will not reverse it regardless of international pressure because doing so would prove that Western powers still control African decision-making. The law also creates precedent that other African countries can follow. When Burkina Faso maintains death penalty despite Western condemnation and our country does not collapse or face devastating consequences, other African nations will recognize that they too can implement security policies that serve their interests regardless of Western opinions. The more African countries that adopt independent positions, the less effective Western pressure becomes. Eventually, Western powers will be forced to accept that they no longer control African governance and that African countries will make decisions based on African priorities. That shift from dependence to independence is essential for genuine African development and dignity. The death penalty decision also exposes Western hypocrisy in ways that undermine Western moral authority across Africa. When African populations see Western countries maintaining capital punishment while condemning African countries for the same practice, they recognize the double standard. When they see Western powers conducting operations resulting in deaths without trial while lecturing Africans about due process, they recognize the hypocrisy. When they see Western organizations funded by Western governments claiming to advocate for African human rights while ignoring crimes committed by Western powers, they recognize the instrumentalization of human rights discourse for geopolitical purposes. Each exposure of Western hypocrisy weakens Western influence and strengthens African determination to chart independent paths. The practical implementation of the death penalty will be careful and limited. Burkina Faso's judicial system will maintain all procedural safeguards, including right to defense counsel, right to appeal, and review by highest courts before any sentence is carried out. The law specifies that capital punishment applies only to the 3 crimes of treason, terrorism, and espionage, and requires strong evidence meeting rigorous standards. The purpose is not to conduct mass executions, but to ensure that individuals who commit the most serious crimes against the state face consequences proportionate to their actions. Most importantly, the existence of death penalty serves deterrent function that may prevent crimes from being committed in the first place. International organizations will continue monitoring Burkina Faso's implementation of the law and publishing reports claiming abuses or arbitrary applications. I expect these reports regardless of our actual conduct, because Western human rights organizations have proven that they criticize African countries regardless of facts. The reports serve political purposes rather than genuine human rights advocacy. They are designed to maintain pressure on African governments, justify continued Western interference, and provide rationale for sanctions or interventions. I will ignore these reports, just as I ignored Western opposition to the law's adoption, because I understand their political motivations. The United Nations Human Rights Council may attempt to pass resolutions condemning Burkina Faso or calling for investigations of our judicial system. These efforts will fail because African countries on the Council increasingly vote based on African solidarity rather than Western preferences. Even if such resolutions pass, they will have no practical effect because Burkina Faso does not recognize the Council's authority to override our sovereign decisions about our legal system. The era when UN bodies could dictate African governance ended when African countries began coordinating positions and refusing to implement decisions that undermine our sovereignty. Listen carefully to my message for African leaders watching how this situation develops. You face similar security threats requiring strong legal responses. You face similar Western pressure demanding that you weaken your defenses against foreign interference. You face similar choice between implementing policies that serve your country's interests or accepting policies that serve Western interests. I urge you to choose sovereignty over approval. Implement the security measures your countries need regardless of international criticism. Coordinate with other African countries facing similar pressures to present united front against Western interference. Recognize that Western opposition to your decisions proves you are moving toward genuine independence rather than continued dependence. The death penalty law is permanent. I will not reverse it in response to international pressure, Western threats, or foreign condemnation. The law serves Burkina Faso's security interests and will remain in force as long as we face threats from traitors, terrorists, and spies. This permanence is not stubbornness or authoritarianism. It is strategic commitment to defending our sovereignty using legal tools that work regardless of whether foreign powers approve. Future governments may choose to modify or abolish the law based on changed circumstances, but that will be decision made by Burkinabe people and their elected or appointed leaders rather than by foreign powers or international organizations. Our sovereignty means we control our laws, and no external pressure will change that reality. The permanence of this law serves multiple strategic purposes beyond the immediate deterrent effect on traitors, terrorists, and spies. First, it demonstrates to our population that their government has the resolve to defend the revolution they support, even when facing intense international opposition. Burkinabe people witnessed decades of previous governments reversing policies whenever Western powers objected. They watched leaders who promised independence ultimately bow to French pressure, IMF conditionality, and diplomatic threats. They saw sovereignty proclaimed in speeches but abandoned in practice whenever foreign displeasure materialized. My refusal to reverse the death penalty despite international condemnation proves that this government is fundamentally different. We mean what we say about independence, and we will maintain policies that serve Burkina Faso's interests regardless of external pressure. Second, the permanence sends unmistakable message to foreign intelligence services operating across Africa. For decades, Western intelligence agencies recruited African agents with relative impunity because the worst consequence of discovery was imprisonment that could be negotiated, shortened through diplomatic pressure, or ended through prisoner exchanges. Spies calculated that financial rewards and potential extraction by their handlers outweighed risks of temporary detention. The death penalty eliminates that calculation entirely. Foreign intelligence services now must offer significantly higher compensation to recruit agents in Burkina Faso, must provide more robust protection and extraction capabilities, and must accept that agents who are caught will face ultimate consequences that cannot be negotiated away. This fundamentally changes the cost-benefit analysis of espionage operations against Burkina Faso. Third, permanence demonstrates to potential coup plotters that foreign backing will not protect them from justice if their attempts fail. Previous coup attempts in Burkina Faso and across Africa often involved conspirators who believed that French support, American diplomatic intervention, or exile in Western capitals would shield them from serious consequences. Plotters calculated that even if coups failed, they would face manageable prison sentences, followed by comfortable exile where they could continue opposing governments they sought to overthrow. The death penalty for treason eliminates those calculations. Coup plotters now understand that failure means death, that foreign backing cannot override Burkinabe law, and that the risk of attempting to overthrow the government is existential rather than manageable. This reality reduces the number of individuals willing to participate in destabilization plots regardless of foreign inducements. Fourth, the law's permanence creates precedent that other African countries can follow when implementing policies that serve their security interests despite Western opposition. When Burkina Faso maintains death penalty for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years despite continuous international pressure, other African governments will recognize that they, too, can implement necessary security measures and sustain them over time, regardless of foreign condemnation. Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, and other African countries facing similar security threats will observe Burkina Faso's experience and conclude that sovereignty requires willingness to be criticized indefinitely for doing what is necessary. The precedent we establish strengthens African independence across the continent. Fifth, permanence exposes the limits of Western pressure mechanisms that have historically controlled African governance. Western powers typically respond to African policies they oppose through escalating pressure, diplomatic statements, then formal condemnations, then aid reductions, then sanctions threats, then actual sanctions, then isolation campaigns. This escalation ladder worked for decades because African governments typically reversed policies before pressure reached higher levels. By maintaining death penalty despite Western pressure reaching significant levels, Burkina Faso demonstrates that the escalation ladder has limited effectiveness against governments genuinely committed to independence. Western powers can issue all the statements and implement all the sanctions they want, but they cannot force sovereign governments to abandon policies that serve national security interests. This reality undermines Western leverage across Africa. Listen carefully to what Western opposition to this law reveals about their true interests in Africa. If Western concern were genuinely about human rights and the sanctity of life, Western governments would oppose capital punishment consistently, regardless of where it is practiced. Instead, Western opposition is selective and political. The United States maintains death penalty in 27 states as of 2025, conducts federal executions for treason and terrorism, and faces minimal international pressure to abolish capital punishment. Western countries that abolish domestic death penalty conduct military operations resulting in deaths without trial, including drone strikes, special operations raids, and targeted killings that occur outside any judicial process. These countries have no moral standing to condemn Burkina Faso for implementing death penalty through transparent legal framework with full judicial process. The selectivity becomes even clearer when examining which countries face intense pressure to abolish death penalty and which do not. African countries maintaining capital punishment face continuous condemnation, aid reductions, and diplomatic isolation. Asian countries maintaining death penalty, including China, India, Japan, and Singapore, face far less pressure, despite conducting significantly more executions than African countries. Middle Eastern countries maintaining death penalty face criticism focused on specific cases rather than demands for complete abolition. The pattern reveals that Western pressure correlates with geopolitical vulnerability rather than human rights principles. Western powers pressure African countries because they still possess enough leverage to attempt controlling African governance, while they avoid pressing countries that can resist Western pressure or retaliate economically. The hypocrisy extends to how Western countries respond to different types of state-sanctioned death. When Burkina Faso restores death penalty through legislative process, judicial review, and legal frameworks guaranteeing defendants' rights, Western governments condemn it as violation of human rights and regression of democratic values. When Western countries conduct drone strikes that eliminate suspected terrorists along with civilian bystanders without any judicial process, trial, or appeal, Western governments justify these operations as necessary security measures and legitimate exercises of sovereign defense. The double standard proves that Western opposition to African death penalty is not principled human rights advocacy but rather political instrument for maintaining influence over African governance. Your legacy, United Nations Human Rights Council, is declining moral authority because of selective enforcement and geopolitical bias that African populations increasingly recognize and reject. You lecture African countries about capital punishment while ignoring Western countries that maintain death penalty and conduct operations resulting in deaths without trial. The Council includes permanent members who have conducted more executions and extrajudicial operations than all African countries combined, yet these members face no accountability or pressure to change their practices. When the Council criticizes African death penalty while remaining silent about Western state-sanctioned deaths, African populations understand that the Council serves Western political interests rather than universal human rights principles. You claim to advocate for universal human rights while applying standards based on political considerations rather than consistent principles. The Council passes resolutions condemning African countries for human rights violations that are less severe than violations committed by Western countries that face no condemnation. The Council investigates African leaders for crimes while ignoring Western leaders who authorize military interventions, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Council demands that African countries meet standards that Western countries do not meet themselves. This selective application of human rights standards destroys the Council's credibility and exposes human rights discourse as instrument of geopolitical control rather than genuine moral framework. You demand that African countries weaken defenses against threats that Western powers are actively sponsoring. The Council opposes African death penalty for terrorism, while Western intelligence services fund, arm, and coordinate with insurgent groups operating across the Sahel. The Council opposes African death penalty for espionage, while Western intelligence agencies conduct massive spy operations throughout Africa, gathering intelligence used to pressure, manipulate, and destabilize African governments. The Council opposes African death penalty for treason while Western governments provide financial support, diplomatic backing, and safe haven to African coup plotters attempting to overthrow governments that pursue independent policies. The pattern is undeniable. Western opposition to African security measures serves Western destabilization efforts rather than African human rights. Your credibility is collapsing across Africa as populations recognize your advocacy serves Western interests rather than African rights. Opinion surveys conducted throughout Africa show declining trust in international human rights organizations and UN bodies that African populations increasingly view as extensions of Western power rather than independent advocates for justice. African civil society organizations that echo Western human rights positions face declining domestic legitimacy as populations question their funding sources and political loyalties. African governments that previously modified policies in response to UN Human Rights Council criticism now increasingly ignore Council resolutions and proceed with policies that serve national interests. The collapse of your credibility is self-inflicted consequence of applying double standards that exposed your political motivations. The Council's declining influence represents a broader pattern of weakening Western institutional control over global governance. For decades after decolonization, Western powers maintained dominance over international institutions including the UN, World Bank, IMF, and various human rights bodies. This institutional dominance allowed Western countries to shape global norms, enforce selective standards, and pressure non-Western countries to adopt Western preferences. That era is ending as non-Western countries gain economic power, build alternative institutions, and refuse to accept Western-dominated governance frameworks. The UN Human Rights Council's declining credibility in Africa is microcosm of this broader shift from Western institutional hegemony to multipolar institutional landscape where Western norms no longer enjoy automatic acceptance. My legacy is defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty by implementing security policies that serve our interests regardless of international opinion. I restored death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage because our revolution requires strong legal deterrence against existential threats that previous legal frameworks failed to address adequately. I signed the law knowing it would generate Western condemnation because protecting Burkina Faso matters infinitely more than Western approval or maintaining good standing with international organizations that serve Western interests. I demonstrated that African countries can make independent decisions based on African security needs and maintain those decisions despite sustained international pressure, diplomatic isolation, and reputational attacks. I proved that sovereignty means having courage to be criticized for doing what we believe necessary. Previous generations of African leaders sought to avoid international criticism by conforming to Western expectations, even when those expectations contradicted African interests. They believed that maintaining good relationships with Western governments and international organizations was essential for economic development, diplomatic legitimacy, and national security. That belief was wrong. African countries that conformed most closely to Western prescriptions remained poor, dependent, and vulnerable to foreign interference. African countries now achieving genuine independence and development are those whose leaders have courage to implement African solutions regardless of Western criticism. Burkina Faso's experience proves that accepting criticism is manageable price for genuine sovereignty. The death penalty decision is one component of comprehensive strategy to build sovereign Burkina Faso that controls its territory, resources, and future. Other components include expelling French military forces that served French strategic interests rather than Burkinabe security, nationalizing gold mines that now generate billions of dollars in revenues for national development rather than foreign shareholders, partnering with Russia to obtain military equipment and training without political conditionality, forming alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger to coordinate regional security, independent of Western-backed ECOWAS, creating 50,000 member volunteers for defense of homeland force that mobilized population for self-defense, and building infrastructure using our own resources rather than debt-creating Western loans. Each of these decisions faced intense Western opposition. Each decision proved essential for Burkina Faso's independence and development. The cumulative effect of these decisions is transforming Burkina Faso from dependent client state that required Western permission for major policy decisions into sovereign nation that makes independent decisions based on our interests and values. The transformation is visible in multiple indicators. Our economy grew 5.5% in 2024, despite Western predictions of collapse following our break with France. Our gold reserves increased from 0 to 11 tons as we keep precious metals domestically rather than exporting them immediately. Our security situation improved as locally recruited defense forces achieved successes that Western-backed approaches never accomplished. Our diplomatic relationships diversified as we built partnerships with Russia, China, Turkey, and other non-Western powers. Our population's confidence increased as they witnessed government defending national interests rather than capitulating to foreign pressure. History will remember who defended their countries when facing real security threats and who abandoned necessary policies because of foreign pressure. The historical record will show that I implemented death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage, despite knowing it would generate international condemnation because Burkina Faso's security required it. The record will show that I maintained the law despite sustained pressure campaigns, diplomatic isolation attempts, and reputational attacks because protecting our revolution mattered more than international approval. The record will show that Burkina Faso survived and thrived under leadership willing to be criticized for doing what was necessary rather than praised for doing what foreigners preferred. The answer is written in Burkina Faso's continued independence despite constant attempts at destabilization by foreign intelligence services, coup plotters, and terrorist organizations. Since I took power on the 30th of September 2022, my government has survived multiple coup attempts, defeated territorial expansion by jihadist groups, expelled foreign military forces, nationalized strategic resources, and implemented revolutionary changes to governance, economy, and society. We achieved these accomplishments while facing unprecedented international pressure, Western sanctions, ECOWAS isolation, and sustained destabilization campaigns. Our survival and success prove that countries defending their sovereignty can withstand foreign pressure that previous generations believed was insurmountable. It is documented in our successful resistance to coup attempts that were backed by foreign intelligence services, providing planning support, financial resources, and promises of recognition if attempts succeeded. We uncovered these plots through improved intelligence capabilities, arrested conspirators before they could execute operations, and prosecuted them through judicial processes that established their guilt. The death penalty now ensures that future coup plotters understand that foreign backing will not protect them from ultimate consequences. This deterrent effect is already visible in reduced coup plotting activity as potential conspirators recalculate risks that are now existential rather than manageable. It is documented in our resistance to terrorism that displaced over 2 million Burkinabe but failed to destroy our state or force us to accept foreign military intervention. We responded by creating Volunteers for Defense of Homeland program that armed 50,000 civilians and reversed jihadist territorial expansion. We partnered with Russia to obtain military equipment superior to what Western partners provided. We coordinated with Mali and Niger through Alliance of Sahel states to prevent terrorists from exploiting borders. We implemented death penalty for captured terrorists to ensure they face consequences proportionate to their crimes. Our approach succeeded where Western counterterrorism strategies failed because we prioritized Burkinabe's security over Western approval. It is documented in our resistance to espionage operations conducted by Western intelligence services seeking to monitor our government, predict our decisions, recruit our officials, and sabotage our policies. We improved counterintelligence capabilities through partnerships with Russian and Chinese security services who shared detection methodologies and technological tools. We arrested foreign agents and their local collaborators, publicly exposed their operations, and expelled diplomatic personnel involved in intelligence activities. We implemented death penalty for espionage to deter future recruitment by making collaboration with foreign intelligence services existentially risky. Our counterintelligence improvements reduced foreign intelligence services' visibility into our government and forced them to operate with greater caution and lower effectiveness. It is proven in our population's overwhelming support for strong measures protecting our revolution from enemies foreign and domestic. Opinion surveys show over 80% of Burkinabe people support death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage. Public rallies demonstrate mass backing for policies that Western governments condemn. Social media reflects widespread frustration with international organizations that criticize our security measures while ignoring the threats we face. Our population understands that death penalty protects their security, that international criticism reflects Western interests rather than concern for Burkinabe welfare, and that defending sovereignty requires accepting foreign condemnation. This popular support provides political foundation for maintaining policies regardless of international pressure. Every prediction you made about death penalty destroying our international relationships proved false. Western governments and international organizations warned that restoring capital punishment would isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically, reduce foreign investment, limit access to international credit, damage our reputation, and undermine our legitimacy. None of these predictions materialized. Our diplomatic relationships with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and other non-Western powers strengthened after we restored death penalty because these countries respect sovereignty and do not condition partnerships on conforming to Western legal standards. Our access to Chinese infrastructure financing and Russian military equipment improved rather than declined. Our reputation among African populations increased as they recognized our courage to defend sovereignty despite Western opposition. Our legitimacy strengthened domestically as populations saw government defending national security rather than prioritizing international approval. We are more sovereign now than before restoring death penalty because we demonstrated that we control our legal system and will not modify it based on foreign preferences. We are more secure because potential traitors, terrorists, and spies now understand they face ultimate consequences rather than manageable risks. We are more independent because we proved we can withstand international pressure that previous generations believed required policy reversals. The death penalty decision contributed to all three outcomes. increased sovereignty, improved security, and genuine independence. Listen carefully, international community. Burkina Faso will defend itself using whatever legal tools our laws authorize, regardless of your opinions about their appropriateness. We will not seek your permission before implementing security policies. We will not modify our laws because you disapprove. We will not prioritize your preferences over our security requirements. Your era of controlling African governance through international pressure, institutional dominance, and moral authority is ending. The new era is African sovereignty, independent decision-making, and rejection of double standards that apply different rules to African countries than to Western countries. Traitors will face justice under our legal system that now includes death penalty for those who attempt to overthrow the government, collaborate with foreign powers against our sovereignty, or destabilize our state. We will provide full judicial process including defense rights, appeals, and review by highest courts. We will maintain transparent procedures that meet our constitutional requirements. But we will not abolish death penalty for treason because foreign governments or international organizations demand it. Traitors who betray Burkina Faso will face consequences our law prescribes, and your objections will not change that reality. Terrorists will face consequences under our legal framework that treats attacks against civilian populations, infrastructure, and territorial integrity as crimes warranting ultimate penalty. We will distinguish between fighters, commanders, financiers, and supporters based on evidence and legal standards. We will provide judicial process even for individuals who rejected legal constraints when conducting their operations. But we will not treat terrorism as ordinary crime, deserving only imprisonment because international organizations believe death penalty is inappropriate. Terrorists who threaten Burkina Faso's existence will face ultimate legal consequences, and your advocacy will not prevent us from defending ourselves. Spies will face ultimate penalties under our law that treats espionage as crime, warranting death penalty, because gathering intelligence for foreign powers enables those powers to pressure, manipulate, and destabilize Burkina Faso. We will investigate suspected spies thoroughly, establish evidence meeting rigorous standards, and provide judicial process guaranteeing defendants' rights. But we will not treat espionage as minor crime punishable by brief imprisonment because Western intelligence services prefer African countries maintain weak deterrence against recruitment. Spies caught working against Burkina Faso will face consequences that eliminate them as threats permanently, and your protests will not modify our approach. And nothing you say will change our determination to protect the revolution that transformed our country from dependent client state accepting French dominance, Western exploitation, and foreign control into sovereign nation, controlling our territory, resources, and future. This revolution represents fundamental break with colonial past and neo-colonial present. It represents rejection of systems that kept Africa poor, dependent, and vulnerable. It represents assertion of African agency, dignity, and power. The death penalty is one tool among many that we employ to defend this revolution against enemies who would restore the old order of foreign domination. We will maintain this tool regardless of international pressure because the revolution is more important than international approval. This is African justice designed by Africans to serve African interests according to African values and priorities. It is not justice system imported from Western models, imposed by international organizations, or constrained by foreign preferences. It reflects our assessment of threats we face, our cultural understanding of appropriate responses to betrayal and violence, our political commitment to defending sovereignty, and our determination to control our legal system. Western countries may not approve of our justice system, but their approval is irrelevant. We did not seek their permission before establishing our laws, and we will not modify our laws based on their disapproval. African justice begins with African assessment of African security threats rather than Western theories about appropriate legal responses. We face terrorism financed by external powers, espionage conducted by foreign intelligence services, and treason coordinated with foreign governments. These are not hypothetical threats discussed in academic papers or international conferences. These are concrete dangers that have displaced millions of our people, destroyed hundreds of our villages, and attempted to overthrow our government multiple times. Our legal system must respond to these real threats with measures that actually deter and eliminate them, rather than measures that satisfy Western sensibilities but fail to protect our population. African cultural understanding of justice emphasizes community protection over individual rights when the two conflict. Western legal philosophy prioritizes individual rights even when protecting those rights endangers community security. That philosophical difference reflects different historical experiences and different contemporary threats. Western countries developed their legal philosophies during periods of relative internal security when external threats were distant. African countries are developing our legal systems while facing active destabilization campaigns, terrorist insurgencies, and foreign interference operations. Our legal priorities necessarily differ because our security situations differ fundamentally. Traditional African justice systems across the continent historically imposed ultimate penalties for crimes that threatened community survival, including treason, collaboration with enemies, and betrayal of collective trust. Colonial powers disrupted these systems and imposed Western legal frameworks that often prioritized procedures over outcomes and individual rights over community protection. Post-independence African governments largely maintained colonial legal systems because Western donors and international organizations conditioned aid and recognition on preserving Western legal models. The result was legal systems that protected individuals who threatened national security more effectively than they protected populations from those individuals. Burkina Faso's death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage represents return to African understanding that community survival takes precedence over preserving lives of individuals who actively work to destroy that community. This is not regression or abandonment of human rights, it is recognition that the most fundamental human right is the right of communities to defend their existence against those who would destroy them. Western legal philosophy that prioritizes protecting traitors over protecting populations they betray reflects luxury of security that Western countries enjoy, but African countries do not. The death penalty also reflects our political commitment to defending sovereignty against external interference that Western legal pressure represents. When international organizations demand that African countries abolish capital punishment while Western countries maintain it, they are asserting authority to dictate African legal standards. When Western governments threaten consequences if African countries implement death penalty, they are claiming power to override African legislative decisions. When human rights groups campaign to pressure African leaders to reverse capital punishment laws, they are attempting to substitute their judgment for democratic will of African populations. All of these interventions are attacks on African sovereignty dressed in human rights language. Our determination to control our legal system is fundamental assertion of independence that previous generations of African leaders failed to make consistently. Colonial powers controlled African legal systems directly through colonial administration. Post-independence African governments theoretically controlled their legal systems, but in practice modified laws whenever Western donors, international organizations, or foreign governments pressured them to do so. The pattern established during decolonization continued for decades. African countries would adopt laws serving national interests. Western powers would object. African governments would reverse or modify the laws, and the cycle would repeat. This pattern proved that legal sovereignty was rhetorical rather than real. Breaking this pattern requires willingness to implement laws that serve African interests and maintain them despite Western opposition. Burkina Faso's death penalty represents that break. We assessed our security needs, determined that capital punishment for treason, terrorism, and espionage was necessary, adopted the law through our legislative process, and maintained it despite immediate international condemnation. We did not seek Western approval before acting. We did not modify the law when Western disapproval materialized. We demonstrated that our legal system is controlled by Burkina Faso rather than by international organizations or foreign governments. That demonstration is essential foundation for genuine legal sovereignty. Western countries may not approve of our justice system, but their approval is irrelevant to whether our legal system serves Burkina Faso's interests. Western legal models developed in contexts completely different from African security environments. Western countries face minimal threats of foreign-backed coups, limited terrorism compared to what African countries experience, and manageable espionage that does not threaten national survival. Their legal systems reflect those security realities with emphasis on individual rights, procedural protections, and rehabilitation over punishment. Those priorities make sense for countries facing the security threats Western countries face. They make no sense for countries facing the existential threats that Burkina Faso faces. We did not seek Western permission before establishing our laws because sovereign nations do not require foreign permission to adopt legislation serving national interests. The entire concept of seeking permission reveals colonial mentality that treats African governments as subordinate entities, requiring approval from Western powers before implementing policies. That mentality persisted long after formal decolonization because international aid architecture, diplomatic pressure systems, and institutional frameworks all operated on assumption that African policy decisions should be vetted by Western governments and organizations before implementation. Burkina Faso rejects that assumption entirely. We adopt laws we determine are necessary, and we implement them regardless of foreign opinions. We will not modify our laws based on Western disapproval, because doing so would prove that our sovereignty is conditional and subject to foreign override. Every time African governments reverse policies because of Western pressure, they demonstrate that their independence is limited. Every time African leaders maintain policies despite Western opposition, they demonstrate that their sovereignty is genuine. The death penalty is test case. If we maintain it despite sustained international pressure, we prove our independence is real. If we reverse it because of Western condemnation, we prove our sovereignty is rhetorical. There is no middle ground. Either we control our legal system or Western powers control it. We choose control. This is Burkina Faso's law adopted through our legislative process, signed by our president, implemented by our courts, and supported by our population. The law's legitimacy derives from Burkinabe institutions and Burkinabe people, rather than from international recognition or Western approval. Our Council of Ministers adopted the bill after deliberative process examining security threats, legal frameworks, and constitutional requirements. Our legislative procedures followed constitutional provisions ensuring proper consideration and debate. I signed the law as president after confirming it served national interests and reflected popular will. Our courts will implement the law through judicial processes, guaranteeing defendants' rights to defense, appeal, and review. Our population supports the law overwhelmingly because they understand the threats it addresses and recognize that strong deterrents are necessary. Opinion surveys show over 80% approval for death penalty for treason, terrorism, and espionage. Public rallies demonstrate mass backing for the law despite international condemnation. Social media reflects widespread support and frustration with foreign interference in our legal decisions. This popular support is more important than international approval because our government serves Burkinabe people rather than foreign governments or international organizations. Democratic legitimacy derives from consent of governed populations, not from approval of external actors. It is not law imposed by external powers who had no role in drafting, adopting, or implementing it. It is not required by international treaties because Burkina Faso is not party to treaties prohibiting capital punishment and would withdraw from any treaties that attempted to override our sovereign legal decisions. It is not subject to foreign modification because no external actor has authority to change Burkinabe laws. The death penalty is purely domestic law adopted through domestic processes to serve domestic interests. Its validity and legitimacy are entirely independent of international opinion. It reflects our sovereignty in the most fundamental sense. We decided what laws govern our territory based on our assessment of our needs. Sovereignty means power to make binding decisions for your territory and population. It means authority to adopt laws, implement policies, and take actions serving national interests. It means freedom from external control or override. Death penalty demonstrates all three aspects of sovereignty. We made decision to restore capital punishment. We have authority to implement it through our judicial system. We reject external attempts to override our decision. These are core attributes of sovereign power. The law serves our security by deterring treason, terrorism, and espionage more effectively than imprisonment alone could accomplish. Security is primary responsibility of government and prerequisite for all other governance functions. Without security, economic development is impossible, social progress is blocked, and independence is threatened. Death penalty enhances security by making collaboration with enemies existentially risky, by permanently eliminating threats that cannot be rehabilitated, and by demonstrating government resolve to defend the state. These security benefits justify the law regardless of international criticism. It demonstrates our independence by proving we can implement policies foreigners oppose and maintain them despite pressure. Independence is not granted by external recognition or protected by international law. Independence is seized and defended by countries willing to act in their interests, regardless of foreign disapproval. Burkina Faso's death penalty is act of independence more significant than symbolic gestures or rhetorical declarations. It proves we control our country's future rather than accepting foreign control. International organizations may condemn our law through resolutions, statements, and reports that have no binding effect on Burkina Faso. The United Nations Human Rights Council can pass resolutions expressing concern, but those resolutions do not override our law or obligate us to change it. Human Rights Watch can publish reports condemning our death penalty, but those reports do not affect our law's validity or our determination to implement it. Amnesty International can campaign for abolition, but those campaigns will not change our policy. These organizations operate under assumption that their condemnation carries weight that should influence African governments. That assumption is false. Their condemnation reflects their preferences, but their preferences do not override our sovereignty. Western governments may oppose our law through diplomatic pressure, aid reductions, or sanctions threats that will not change our determination to maintain it. France may reduce diplomatic engagement in response to our death penalty, but we expelled French military forces and ended French economic dominance, so French pressure has limited effect. The United States may criticize our law through State Department reports, but we do not depend on American aid or approval for our governance. European Union may condition future assistance on reversing capital punishment, but we are building partnerships with Russia, China, and other non-Western powers who respect our sovereignty. Western opposition has less impact than Western governments assume because we have diversified our relationships and reduced our dependence on Western support. Human rights groups may campaign against our law through advocacy, media engagement, and pressure on international institutions that will not override our sovereign decision. These organizations believe their moral authority should influence African governance even though they lack democratic legitimacy in Africa and serve primarily Western interests. Their campaigns reflect Western values rather than African priorities. Their funding comes largely from Western governments and foundations. Their advocacy consistently aligns with Western foreign policy interests. African populations increasingly recognize that Western-funded human rights organizations serve as instruments of Western influence rather than genuine advocates for African welfare. Their opposition to our death penalty strengthens rather than weakens support for the law. None of these external actors can override our law because we are a sovereign nation that controls our legal system without foreign interference. Sovereignty means external actors can criticize but cannot compel. They can condemn but cannot override. They can pressure, but cannot control. Burkina Faso's response to external pressure is simple. We hear your objections, we reject your authority to override our decisions, and we maintain our law regardless of your disapproval. That response is possible only for governments genuinely committed to independence rather than seeking international approval. And this is what genuine independence looks like when African leaders refuse to bow to Western pressure, maintain policies that serve national interests regardless of international opinion, and demonstrate that sovereignty means controlling your country's future rather than accepting foreign control. Independence is not abstract concept discussed in philosophical terms or rhetorical flourish included in speeches. It is concrete reality reflected in ability to implement policies that foreigners oppose and maintain those policies despite sustained pressure campaigns designed to force reversals. Burkina Faso's death penalty demonstrates our independence more clearly than any speech or declaration could because actions prove intentions more reliably than words. We said we would restore capital punishment. Western powers said we should not. We restored it anyway on the 8th of December 2025. Western powers pressured us to reverse it through diplomatic statements, international condemnations, and threats of consequences. We maintained it. That sequence proves our independence is real rather than rhetorical. We proved we control our legal system. We proved we prioritize our interests over Western approval. We proved we can withstand international pressure. We proved our sovereignty is genuine. The death penalty will remain Burkina Faso's law for as long as we face threats requiring ultimate deterrent. No amount of international pressure will change that reality. No level of Western condemnation will force reversal. No campaign by human rights organizations will override our sovereign decision. We will maintain this law because it serves our security, reflects our values, and demonstrates our independence. That is what sovereignty means. That is what genuine independence requires. And that is what Burkina Faso will continue to demonstrate regardless of international opinion. The death penalty is a permanent fixture of Burkina Faso's legal system that will remain in force as long as we face threats requiring ultimate deterrence. Future modification or abolition will occur only if Burkinabe people and their leaders decide our security situation no longer requires capital punishment. That decision will be ours alone, made according to our assessment of our security needs, implemented through our legal processes, and justified based on our interests rather than foreign preferences. Until that day comes, the law remains, traitors face death, terrorists face ultimate consequences, spies face execution, and Burkina Faso remains sovereign nation that defends itself regardless of international opinion.